Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Career Design Podcast. And I'm super excited. I'm your host, Jennifer Turliuk, and I'm here with our guest, Amy Bond. Amy had an awesome career transition, which I'm excited to hear more about. She went from being a full-time lawyer to now being the founder of Pull and Dance Studios, as well as continuing as a part-time lawyer. Super excited to have her on the show. Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. And congratulations on your book. That is so exciting.
Oh, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. So we met, I guess now about, maybe even
It might be 6 years ago.
6 years ago at Camp Grounded in the Bay Area. Super cool camp. For those who haven't heard of it, it's like a digital detox camp. Check your phones at the door, like super fun, capture the flag, typewriters. Amazing camp. That was such an awesome time.
That was such an awesome time. And we actually didn't know each other's names for like the first 4 days that we hung out all the time together. So I think that was, it's such a San Francisco thing to be like, I need to pay somebody to take my phone away from me so that I could go gallivant around at like the redwoods. But it was such a fun experience. And like everyone we met at that camp has gone on to do just amazing things. So
yeah, it was super cool. And I remember we were bus buddies. We were on the same bus.
Yes.
We were back of the bus buddies. There were some notes passed. It was super cool. And yeah, not knowing each other's names or occupations or, any ages, like any biographical details except nicknames.
Yeah. Wait, what was your nickname again?
Mine was Spunky.
Spunky, yes. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And I was Polarina.
Yeah, exactly. Super cool. So yeah, that was a really awesome time. So yeah, thanks so much for joining us. I really would love to start with how did you make that career transition, or like where did your career start out and how did you get from there to where you are today?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I'm watching Mad Men right now, and it's very clear that like in the old days, there was like you started as like a copy editor, like assistant to a copy editor, maybe a secretary, and then you became junior copy editor, and then you became copy editor, and then maybe you become a creative director 30 years into your career. And like there's very like natural progressions for a career historically, I think. And I don't know anybody today who has like a linear career progression, and I'm no different than anyone else. So let's see where I started. I guess I graduated from Berkeley in 2009. It was the height of like the last recession. At my graduation, that guy who Will Smith played in a movie like about being a stockbroker was like the speaker at my graduation at Berkeley. And he talked about how like he's supposed to be a motivational speaker, but he basically was just like, you all are screwed. This job market is terrible. Like, good luck, but it's going to be hard for you. And that was like our motivational speech. Wow. And so that was alarming. I was like, well, I'll stay in school. I was interested in the law. Everybody I knew who was a lawyer was a type A kind of workaholic like me. And so I was like, well, I'm like those people, so I'll go to law school. And so I did. I moved to Portland, Oregon. I lived there for a year, studying for the LSAT and then teaching other people how to take the LSAT with my first little like small business. And then I went to law school in Boston, graduated in 2013. The economy was much better. And my husband and I moved back to the Bay Area from Boston so that we could both start careers in tech. And I say start, I actually mean for me to start a career in tech and for Keith, my husband, to continue his career in tech because he'd worked in software at that point for 20 years. I got my first job. I remember my first interview. I was like 27, had just passed the California bar exam, and I was being interviewed by these like 22-year-olds, wonder kids who had like billions or sorry, millions of VC funding. And they would like interview me with like bare feet and just like chilling, you know? And it was just like such a Silicon Valley experience. I started working in tech. I got my first tech job working for a like a wealth management startup. They were going to disrupt wealth management. They're doing great. They're doing that disruption thing. After that, I kind of got addicted to the equity part of startups, the like kind of like, you know, like go big or go home mentality of working in startups. And so I worked at 4 more after that first one. And everybody was disrupting some old industry, and I was along for the rocket ship. At every startup I worked at, I think I was the 9th hire. And so I got to be on a lot of rocket ships and watch other people build their businesses. In 2013, I was able to finally pay off my student loans. I had over $200,000 in law school loans. 2016. So 3 years later, I was able to pay off my student loans. And it was only after I was able to pay off my student loans that I was able to sit back and kind of say, okay, like, what do I really want to do? And I loved working in startups. The part that I loved most about it was being able to build a business with other people. And so I kind of looked to the left and looked to the right. There were no other pole studios that were really doing a good job in the Bay Area. And so I said, okay, I'm going to start my own pole studio. And I started San Francisco Pole and Dance in 2016 while I was still working at a startup. So I did both. I would work at the startup kind of by day, 5 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then I would run over to or change browsers and then work on my pole studio from like, 5 to midnight. And I kind of did both for about 6 months before it was really clear that my studio was taking off and like it was time to kind of go all in on the studio and expand and build into a bigger location, which we did 3 times. And since then we just opened our 3rd location and kind of off to the races.
Oh, that's amazing. So where are your locations?
My first studio is still in San Francisco. So everybody knows where California Carpet on Folsom is. So right above California Carpet on Folsom Street in San Francisco, we've got a 3,500 square foot space with 7 rooms, 3 pole studios, flexibility space, and an aerial space there. Our second location is in Oakland. So Oakland Pole and Dance is across the street from Lake Merritt in Oakland. And then our 3rd location that will be actually opening for the first time after COVID restrictions are lifted is in Berkeley, which is just down the street from where I am right now.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So you were working as a lawyer, and you were working as a lawyer for a number of different tech startups. Is that right? And like, how did you take us back to how you started thinking about opening your first studio, like how that became something you were interested in, or like were you dissatisfied with your work? Like how did you decide to go about that?
No, I mean, I loved working in startups. I thought it was really fun. I never felt, I think a lot of people start their own thing because they feel like their soul is being sucked. Like you hear that phrase a lot, my soul was being sucked. I never had a sucking sensation of my soul. My soul actually always felt, but I'm just a worker. Like when I worked at Starbucks, I loved it. Like, every job I've had, I've loved. So, the parts that I think the parts that I don't love are when you work with people who are toxic. So putting that part aside, like the actual work of any job I've had, I've really enjoyed. So I never had that, but I did know that I wanted to start my own business. I've, always been very, they say that some people are just naturally entrepreneurial. That's probably true for me. I tend to look at people's businesses and I don't think like, oh, that's such a nice thing, or like, oh, that ice cream shop. I love, let's call it Wendy's ice cream shop. And when I go to an ice cream shop, I'm like, how can we operationalize this and like make it more streamlined? Like that's a great vanilla bean, but like, how can we tell a story so we sell more of it?
That's awesome. So then how did you decide? So you knew you wanted to start your own thing.
So
How did you decide what you wanted to start or when?
Yeah. In the Bay Area, there are a lot of people who are starting cool things. So after I had worked at, a handful of startups, a lot of the people who I had used to work with at the startups before the last one started coming to me and saying, hey, I want to start my own thing. And I think you should run operations for it. And when I worked in tech, it was legal, but it was also operations and some HR and kind of like everything that wasn't engineering. So that's pretty common when you're the first non-technical, as they say, like non-technical in the sense of engineering, is that you'll do basically everything except engineering. And then once you get a series, then you hire people to do work under you. And so that was a pretty typical role for me as I would do operations. I loved when I would go into startups and the founders, who are always like two engineers, had never thought about workers' compensation, and they'd never thought about like how to create a spreadsheet around equity or use Carta or, all the things that just kind of are the bucket of operations because they're so focused on building product. And so as people I had worked with started their own startups, they would ask me like, hey, I would love for you to join this thing. And I just knew that I wanted to build a pole studio. I had been pole dancing for 6 years. I took my first pole dance class in the same day that I started law school. And by the time I was done with law school, I was organizing my law school schedule around when I wanted to be taking pole dancing classes. And I was going to New York every weekend so I could train with my favorite pole dancers. And I was competing in professional level competitions. And it just is like what makes my heart soar. And the thing that was interesting about pole is that it's still like this burgeoning industry. It's a pole as recreation, as fitness, as a movement art that people pay for classes to go to, has really only been around for about 10 years. And so at that point in 2016, it's really only been around for 6 years. And there wasn't anybody in the Bay Area who was really doing it on a bigger level, it was a lot of like 1,000 square foot spaces with 5 poles in it. And, somebody who just loved pole dancing. And so they started a business so that they could be pole dancing all the time. But there weren't very many people in the pole industry who had started a business because they loved operations and they loved business and they loved pole dancing. Like those 3 things, I guess, don't often go together, but they do for me. And so I wanted to build a space where, it wasn't just one small studio with 3 classes a day. It was a bigger thing with multiple classes a day and customer service and a front desk and kind of like all the things you see in more traditional fitness spaces. And so I was able to acquire a studio that I had been a teacher at. In 2016, they approached me and said, the previous owners, they said, hey, we never really wanted to run this business. The owner was a competitive pole dancer. She really wanted to just be pole dancing and found that doing the business side took all of her time. So she actually wasn't pole dancing as much as she wanted to. And I really wanted to build a business. And so it was perfect kind of opportunity to build a business in an industry that I love. And so I did basically, I drafted our asset purchase agreement, bought the materials and took over the lease from them, rebranded as San Francisco Pole and Dance. And that's how we got started in our first space. And it was really hacky. It was like, me and a friend painted the walls and like I ordered a sticker that was like $50, and that was like our logo. And like I had paid a friend like $100 to do the logo. So it was all very like DIY scraped together. Like I think we spent a total for the asset purchase plus the actual like the things in the space and taking over the lease. I think I spent 20 grand on that, and that was it. So I was able to start the first studio with $20,000. And I was like paying my instructors through Venmo for the first 6 months before we really got going and professionalizing.
Oh wow, that's amazing. And how did you go from that to where you are today with the 3 studios?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just a lot of trial and error. So once, it's fine to pay instructors through Venmo if you have 4 instructors, but once you have 50 instructors, and the California laws changed quite a bit between 2016 and 2020 in terms of employment status. So, this big court case called Dynamex happened at the California Supreme Court level. That meant that all of these drivers would need to be reclassified as employees rather than contractors. And that affected my industry as well. It was very clear to me that we needed to be paying our instructors as employees. So we got set up with like all of the HR software that you need to do that. And we were really just busting at the seams in terms of we had 8 poles and then this small side area, and we ran 2 classes at a time, and we had we're approaching the fire code limits of how many people could be in the space, and had wait lists for our classes within like 3 months. So I talked to the building owners, and then I expanded into a bigger space down the hall. And then another space next to that space became available like a year ago. So I was able to expand into another pole studio. And so the expansion, I got really lucky with the space that I'm in and the landlords that I have, because the expansion ended up being pretty easy in that it was in the same building as the one that we started in the small studio we started in. And honestly, I feel like my landlords have been along with me for the ride. Like they're so excited about the success of my business. And that honestly, I have pretty terrible landlords at another location. And it really does affect like the morale of the team and how you're able to feel about the space and grow the business. And so that was one part that was really, I think, mattered a lot more than I could have expected, is having these kind of people who are rooting me on, who are actively involved in my success, like everyone from my landlords to students who became instructors to instructors who I have one instructor who became my general manager and now is my right-hand person. And they're, basically the COO of the studios and helped me run everything.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, it was just very iterative. Like there was no big, like I come in and everything's operationalized. It was just keep chipping away at it every day and until you get a little bit better and a little bit better.
And how did you get it to the point where you were having waiting lists and everything, like within months of opening? What do you think it was that led to that?
So it was a couple of things. One is that I entered a market that didn't already have a really big studio to go to. I think San Francisco just ended up being the city, like the one city in America that didn't have a studio that was big and had a lot of options in terms of more advanced level classes and didn't have a lot of instructors. And my guess about why that is the case is because San Francisco real estate is just so expensive and it's hard to get a lease. And very few landlords are going to take on an artistic business when their alternative is to rent to a startup that has millions of dollars in funding that can do both a down payment and the first year's rent with cash up front. And San Francisco, pre-COVID, I do wonder how this will change after COVID, but I think San Francisco has just, the art scene has really suffered. And the building that I'm in had 4 dance studios when I moved in, and now we're the only one left. And that was before COVID hit. So, all the other spaces that were dance studios are now occupied by startups. And I think that is something that's happening to the art scene across the Bay Area and probably most other metropolitan cities, though COVID is going to change that landscape because of work from home and all of that.
Oh, interesting. And how did you end up going from having the one in San Francisco to then opening your second or in Oakland and then your third in Berkeley?
Yeah, so both of those are slightly different stories. Our second studio in Oakland, we really just opened that because we had so many students coming from Oakland commuting to San Francisco. I had one woman tell me she worked in San Francisco, but she had a cat that needed to like have medication at like 4 p.m. every day. And so she would leave work at 3, go home and give her cat medication at 4, and then go all the way back across the Bay Bridge so she could come take classes at our studio and then go back home to Oakland. And I remember just thinking like, wow, that's a lot of friction to go through to take a active flexibility class at Pole and Dance Studios. But I started hearing a lot of like, not that extreme of stories, but a lot of like, I live in Oakland, but I travel here for classes. And probably like crossing a bridge doesn't sound crazy to people in other places, but crossing the Bay Bridge at rush hour is like you're really like undertaking something. Like that's a good hour commute to to cross a bridge and come from the East Bay to San Francisco. And students were doing it because they loved our classes and they loved our instructors. And so it was clear that we did like a survey that showed 25% of our students were coming from the East Bay. And that's when we decided, okay, let's look into real estate in the East Bay. And then that led us to open our next studio, Oakland, in 2018. So just shy of 2 years later.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What about the Berkeley one?
So the Berkeley studio is slightly different. I moved to Berkeley shortly after I opened the Oakland studio. My husband and I bought a house here, and Berkeley and Oakland are very close to each other. And then COVID hit in 2020, and all of these small businesses, especially fitness studios, statistically have been found to be the most impacted financially by COVID. So a lot of small businesses and small fitness studios started closing permanently. So not just closing for COVID, but closing permanently. And my friend Kristen Brown, who owned a studio in Berkeley, and I were talking, and she said, I'm getting ready to make a lot of big life changes. My husband and I recently bought a house farther outside, so they're not in Berkeley anymore. And I've really been reevaluating my priorities, and I don't think I want to run the studio anymore. And I think I'm going to close it. And I was like, well, can we talk about your financials? I was like, tell me about your student base, tell me about your operational costs, tell me about your rent price. And it ended up being that her studio was like an excellent deal. So I did another asset purchase agreement, purchasing the assets from her, and taking over a new lease with her landlord. And we've done over the last 3 months been building out Berkeley Pole and Dance, and it's finally ready for when restrictions are lifted to reopen instead of as Phoenix. Phoenix Aerial Art and Pole is the old name. It will be reopening as Berkeley Pole and Dance. So that's the third location, and we're really excited to get started. The entire instructor team who worked at that studio before, most of them had worked there for over 10 years. So, that they've really created a community and a special place where a lot of the same people have been coming for years. And luckily, we're able to retain most of those instructors as we have an eye on reopening.
That's great. So during COVID time, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just want to say, going back to your question about like, why do I think that the classes were selling out so much? I think the first part is that there is a vacuum of really good studios, but then the second part is that the instructors who have hired and who are in the Bay Area are just incredible instructors. And I think Soul Cycle, which is a cycling brand, really capitalized on this concept about 10 years ago as well, when they first started getting going as a cycling studio. But what their research, and they're a little bit more sophisticated. I'm just a dude building a business, but Soul Cycle's like got McKinsey on call, and they're, I believe, owned by Equinox. And a lot of their research found that the number one reason people go back to classes is because their instructors are excellent. And so we did a lot around developing our instructors and taking the instructors that people already loved and making sure that they were well paid as employees and given great benefits so that they wanted to work for us. And I honestly, that's probably the number one reason that people come to our studios and our classes, because the instructor team is second to none.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah.
You said something that I found really interesting, which was that, you've always been like a worker bee, if I remember the words correctly, and that you've loved every job you've ever done. I actually haven't really heard that from anyone before that I recall.
Really?
No. So that's pretty cool. Could you tell us more about that? Like, I'd love to hear more about, how that came about, if it's always been that way, or if you have any tips for people to have that mindset.
That's a really good question. I think some of it probably is just to do with, I really like people, and most jobs are working with people. So if you find, there are some people who could be slightly obnoxious, but most people are just fascinating to me. And if I get to spend time with a person, I'm usually going to uncover something fascinating about them that I can learn from. And I think that's kind of how I approach most interactions with other people, is just like, okay, what do you have to teach me? Like, I want to learn something cool from you. And I think that's kind of like the thing in the back of my mind. So, like, whether it's people in Silicon Valley who are building cool companies, or I worked at this one startup that was doing software for construction workers. And so I would go teach construction workers how to use the software. And every single one of them was like fascinated, whether they were like outside of the Arctic tundra in Alberta, Canada, and they'd been working a forklift for 40 years, or whether it's like the dude who started Blue Bottle. Like, people are so interesting, and being around people and learning from people just like lights me on fire. So that's probably where that comes from.
Oh, that's awesome. And then the other question I had about something you mentioned is, going from being a lawyer to an entrepreneur, although I understand you still practice law a bit on the side, which I'd love to hear more about too. But going from a lawyer, and you'd mentioned, being able to pay off, I think it was $200,000 in debt in 3 years. That's pretty amazing. So obviously it was
let's actually talk about that, because it's actually not that amazing in that, like, I had a personal success. It's amazing in that, like, one of the startups that my husband worked at, and I do think it's annoying that it's the startup my husband worked at and not a startup that I worked at, but either way, we basically like struck gold. Like, the startup did really well. It got acquired by a big corporation, and then we basically had like a bucket of money rain on us. And so I was able to pay off my law school loans. If I hadn't been able to do that, I still would have had a $4,000 a month or $3,500 a month after I refinanced my student loans through SoFi. I probably wouldn't have been able to start my own business. Like, until that was paid off, I had, $4,000 a month in rent, because it's the Bay Area and that's what you pay for a studio apartment. And I had $35,000 to $4,000 a month payment for student loans for law school. And after you take those two expenses out of, that double income, you end up not having a ton left over. And that's even from two people who make over six figures in the Bay Area. So, so I would say that was really more a stroke of luck than anything else, where how many people work at startups, how many people actually like strike the gold pot. It's a very gold rush mentality here today in San Francisco. And we were really lucky. And hard work really had nothing to do with that, besides that we both were just really addicted to this kind of world of unstable jobs. Instead of like working at a Google and making like a steady income, we were both like, let's work for as little as possible and a lot of equity everywhere we go. And so after 4 to 5 years of that, we struck the gold mine.
Oh, that's amazing. Through like you were saying, having equity at different companies, and then some of them doing really well. That's awesome.
I mean, and it's a long horizon too. Like the one startup that got acquired, we got paid out quickly, but most of the startups I worked at that I have equity in still haven't been acquired, are doing quite well, but haven't been acquired yet. And like, that will probably pay off over like a, closer to a 10-year horizon than a 3-year one.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess nonetheless, so that was a really fortunate opportunity. But then going from like, well-paid lawyer, like making over 6 figures, to contemplating being an entrepreneur, what was the thought process like? Or were you worried? Did that hold you back? Or is that why you did it like part-time? Or like, what was it like?
Yeah, I do think a lot of people have said to me, oh, you must be such a risk taker. You're an entrepreneur. You take a lot of risk. That's so inspiring. Or I hate that word. And or like so cool. And I don't know, like actually, I think there's a lot of like myths that our country is founded on, like the myth of the hard worker, the myth of the bootstrapper, the myth of like you work hard and then you'll succeed in the world. And like in this like hyper pumped capitalist world we live in, where like 3 corporations run the entire country, like Wall Street's totally disentangled from like how everyday people actually live their lives. And we've seen that through COVID more than anything. People, bread lines are longer than ever, and like the stock market's rallying. Like it makes no sense unless those two things have nothing to do with each other, which we're seeing right now. So I guess, yes, I'm a risk taker, but I also waited until I was quite stable before I took a risk. So like, how big of a risk was it? Like I still have one foot in the door in terms of I work now with 6 different startups as a consultant. So I do legal work for startups in a consulting capacity for equity, because like, that's the thing that gets me hot. And, but like I could go back to working a salaried job very quickly if I wanted to. And I think a lot of people who start businesses are already wealthy. And so I don't want to like perpetuate the idea that like, yeah, like, put $100,000 on Black 42 and like, you'll win too. You just have to put yourself out there, because that's bullshit. And like most people who start companies, I think already have a level of stability and financial security that most people in the world will never see. And I am one of those people. So I don't think it was actually that risky. It was just something I really wanted to do. And at the end of the day, when I'm making a decision about what I want to do next, it's, is this a cool story? Is this going to be really fun? And the answer to those 2 questions about starting a pole dance empire is yes, let's go. So
those are really good questions to ask oneself. And yeah, makes total sense. So speaking of the pole dance empire, what's next for it?
Yeah, well, I just bought a house in Portland. So I am talking to studio owners in the Portland, Oregon area about taking over their businesses. And if those don't come to fruition, I'll probably start my own and every time I go up to my house in Portland, I walk down the street looking in like open retail spaces, which there are quite a few of right now, and just looking for the ones that have high ceilings. And so Portland pole and dance will probably be the next one, and I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, hopefully at a bigger and bigger scale.
That's so cool. And what motivates you to keep opening more, or like be, looking in those windows and that sort of thing?
Oh, that's such a good question. Inertia. Because I've been doing it and I know how to do it. I just keep doing it. Maybe. No, I really believe in pole dancing. It really did change my life in terms of, it's just in this Netflix documentary called Strip Down, Rise Up. And it's about women's empowerment through pole dancing. And it's actually quite controversial in the pole community. Many people who are pole dancers don't feel represented by this movie, but I'm in it and I am represented by this movie. My personal story is in it. And one of the things that pole really did for me is it like reconceptualized my relationship to my body. And it became a lot less about like, what does my body look like in the world? And became a lot more of like, what is the cool things I can do with my body? And wow, look at this strength that I have that I never knew that I could have. And we're still in a world that tells women that they can't do pull-ups. Like the New York Times, like 4 years ago, published a piece about like why women are terrible at pull-ups. Like the ever enduring myth of like women aren't strong is like everywhere when you look for it, and subconsciously all around us. So I got really excited by like all this cool stuff I could do with my body. And then I started realizing that every studio I went to was run by a woman. Like there were basically no men. And so there's this like extreme dichotomy in my life of like being in the legal profession and then working in tech, which is mostly male dominated, to being in pole dance studios, which is like mostly 95% women, and like bad bitches who are like throwing themselves upside down in the air. And like, the studio that I first went to, I became really close to, shout out to Boston Pole Fitness in Boston. The owner was of Boston Pole Fitness was building her pole studio. And then I met another friend who wanted to build one in North Shore. And I was meeting these people who wanted to build like a female focused industry around like women's strength. And so many people I met through pole dancing became my closest friends and like my ride or dies, my greatest cheerleaders. And like, it was like that spirit of community of women supporting women that made me feel like I could fly. And I wanted to bring that kind of community to other cities. So we started in San Francisco and it was awesome. And it definitely has become that in the middle of the most male dominated tech capital of the world. Like there's on Folsom and 8th, like a block this way from Twitter and a block this way from Airbnb. There's this like, women's empowerment situation happening at San Francisco Pole and Dance. And so many people are like finding jobs because they like pole dance next to somebody who knows somebody who can get them, and it becomes a really tight knit and close community of people supporting each other. And then we did the same thing in Oakland, and I see those groups form in my classes, and I get to kind of watch them flourish and grow on social media outside of class. And I have no doubt that we'll do the same thing in Berkeley and then in Portland and then whatever comes next. And so those communities are the thing that drive me. I love building community for women.
That's amazing. And you've still kept law as a part of your life, right? Can you say a bit more about that and how you decided to do that?
Yeah. So I work with startups, and that's probably 10 hours a week that and I just really like startups. Like I love that all the founders I meet are like slightly insane. And, they like, I have one who wants to build a LinkedIn for artists. And I have another one of my startups, like one is doing IoT and like wants to put a connected device on like every single thing that exists in the world and like build the infrastructure for that. And it's like those are both really lofty goals. And it kind of takes somebody who's a little insane to build big things like that. And so I just really like working with founders and being able to bring like the kind of dry side to things, like, hey, you and your friend are on really good terms now while you're in the infancy stage of wanting to build your business. But did you know that 80% of startups fail because of founders disputes? Like, let's get a founders agreement going, baby. Like it's like, it's really fun for me. And I just like being like, kind of like still being able to help other people build their things, because I know how lonely it can be as a founder too. Like it's you're the one paying the checks at the end of the day, and probably not getting paid for the first 5 to 7 years of it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, that's really nice of you to do that. And then what does your time for the studios and that whole area, I guess you're running stuff virtually right now, so what does your time spent on that company look like?
Yeah. So right now, with the studios closed, you would think that there's no work to be done, but it almost feels like there's more work to do when your businesses are closed than when they're open. A lot of the work lately has been around building out the Berkeley studio and rallying the team and getting them excited for what a new chapter in the space's future looks like, and building out curriculum. And we do another arm of our business has been really focused around teacher trainings, because that's been a hard thing for me as we've expanded our student base really quickly. I've also found myself teaching so many of the classes, and once you have 3 or 4 locations, like you just can't zip around everywhere and teach as much as I have been. So building out teacher trainings to get new instructors onboarded and teaching in our studios has been like my biggest thing lately, especially as we're starting to open our outdoor patio classes at our Oakland studio. And as we look with an eye, probably 3 weeks into April, we'll be opening with limited classes in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley. So getting our teacher team really trained and up and running has been a big focus. And my guess is it will continue to be a focus, because I really think, as people haven't been moving much in 2020 and through this COVID period, that people are going to be really recommitting to fitness and pole dancing and all the kinds of fitness that are besides pole dancing once the vaccines are widely distributed and things have reopened a bit more. So a lot of it is planning. A lot of the original things we were doing when COVID first hit was, okay, what do we do if, we're still closed in May? And that was like a 2-month period. And we had all these plans, and then California came out with all of these cleaning regulations for studios. So I was in the studio with my general manager, Josh, like trying out these different kinds of sprays and seeing how they worked on the floors. And do they make it harder for dancers to move or pivot on their, a force starch? And so like very granularly, like cleaning has become a big, a kind of very fascinating world, because there's so much of it required in a post-pandemic era. So that's like a sample of the things.
Wow, so many different things. That's really interesting. It's like each day seems to have different aspects to it.
Yeah, and it makes it very fun. I'm usually at my computer between 7 and 9, working through, the never-ending slog of email, and then from 9 to 11, I try to be very dedicated on like curriculum development or teacher training development, or something that is a little less reactive and a little bit more building. And then there's usually 2 or 3 classes throughout the day that are 2 or 3 private lessons throughout the day that I'll end up teaching and coordinating with my instructor team and my general managers. That is another 2 to 3 hours. So, it's a lot of my favorite thing, which is working with people.
That's awesome. And you said there's going to be patio classes soon, or there are patio classes?
Yeah, starting this Wednesday, our Oakland studio has an outdoor space. So last year they're called stage poles. We put these 5 stage poles outside on our patio, and they're all distanced. So they're socially distanced, and we have classes outside in the backyard. And it actually ends up feeling a lot like summer camp because there's these big trees that are kind of like hanging over the poles, and like chestnuts or like acorns will like drop from them, and then these squirrels will like run out and pick up the acorns, and you're like, oh, don't mind the squirrel, while you're like throwing yourself upside down on a pole. So it's been very fun to have that space, and kind of like doing pole outside introduces all of these other things that you wouldn't expect. So we'll have those classes started for people who aren't yet comfortable for going indoors, probably through the entire summer until it gets dark again.
Oh, that's amazing. So we've got outdoor classes, indoor classes happening soon, all sorts of fun. Well, Amy, thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. I definitely learned a lot, and it was super great having you on the show.
Yeah, this has been so much fun chatting with you, Jen.
Yeah, thanks so much.